This story is based on official reports and eyewitness accounts, and this is the story of Japan Airlines Flight 123. On the evening of August 12, 1985, a Japan Airlines Boeing 747 departed from Tokyo's Haneda Airport. The plane was packed with 509 passengers and 15 crew members heading to Osaka, which was about an hour away. This was a busy route in Japan, with many people traveling between the two cities every day. The flight was particularly crowded because it was the start of the Japanese holiday season, and many passengers were making their annual trips back to their hometowns. As they boarded the plane that evening, little did they realize that a significant issue had been silently developing within the aircraft for years, completely undetected. The flight held a special significance for the pilots as well. In the captain's seat sat 39-year-old First Officer Yutaka Sasaki. For this particular flight, he would assume the role of captain while being supervised by the actual captain. With nearly 4,000 hours of experience under his belt, Sasaki was being considered for a promotion to captain after serving as a first officer on the Boeing 747 for the past 6 years. This flight presented an opportunity for him to demonstrate his readiness for the promotion. To the right of Yutaka Sasaki, supervising him, was the seasoned Captain Masami Takahama, aged 49. With a flying career that began in 1966, Takahama had amassed an impressive 12,000 hours of flight experience. Having flown the Boeing 747 for over 10 years, he was well versed in its operations and intricacies. At the flight engineer station, situated behind the pilots, was the third crew member, 46-year-old Hiroshi Fukada. Like the pilots, Fukada possessed extensive experience with the Boeing 747. The crew had never received training for the specific emergency or any other emergencies they would encounter on that day. At 6:05 p.m., Flight 123 started to push back from the gate at Tokyo. On a hot summer evening, the country experienced thunderstorms all day long. To avoid the storms, the pilots decided to take a slightly different route over the sea. Since it was a short flight, the plane quickly reached its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet before starting its descent. At 6:12 p.m., First Officer Sasaki aligned the aircraft with the runway and applied full power for takeoff. In a matter of moments, the colossal jet, carrying 524 passengers and crew, became airborne. 747 ascended over Tokyo and gradually executed a right turn, setting its course towards Osaka. In the initial stages of the flight, everything went as planned as the plane climbed higher. The cabin was pressurized by the air from the engines, resulting in a higher pressure inside than outside. However, as the aircraft continued to ascend and the air outside became thinner, the pressure difference between the cabin and the external environment grew. This caused the aluminum structure of the plane's skin to stretch slightly under the pressure from the air inside. As the plane ascended, the flight engineer in the cockpit monitored the cabin pressure to ensure it remained suitable for the passengers. Unfortunately, either the flight engineer nor anyone else on board was aware of a critical vulnerability in the bulkhead at the rear of the aircraft. This bulkhead served as a barrier to hold the pressurized cabin air, but it had a hidden weakness. Years ago, during a landing in Osaka, the plane suffered a hard impact on its tail, causing significant damage to the bulkhead. The damage was severe enough for the plane to be grounded and undergo extensive repairs. However, it was later discovered that the repairs to the bulkhead were not done correctly. This resulted in tiny cracks gradually growing with each subsequent flight as the plane climbed and the cabin air pressed against the weakened bulkhead. Now, high above the Pacific, the compromised bulkhead suddenly failed, leading to a catastrophic event. Chaos ensued as the pressurized cabin air forcefully escaped through the newly opened holes in the rear of the plane. This sudden surge of pressure caused a massive section of the aircraft's tail, including vital components like the rotor, auxiliary power unit, and critical control systems, to be torn off. Passenger oxygen masks immediately dropped, and people hurriedly put them on. In the cockpit, the loud alarm warned the pilots that the air inside the plane was now too thin to breathe. Little did the pilots know that these problems were just the start of their troubles. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, the captain quickly decided to turn the plane back to Tokyo for an immediate landing. He signaled for help by setting the transponder to the distress code 7700, which is universally recognized. The first officer followed the captain's instructions and initiated a right turn to redirect the plane towards Tokyo.
Okay, it's been 1, 2, 3, we got some immediate trouble. turn back to Roger. Maintain 220, over.
Roger, approve as requested.
Hold on, circulation, please.
Roger, you want right or left turn?
Going to right turn, over.
However, as the plane began its right turn, it started banking at an excessively steep angle. Despite the first officer's efforts, the plane couldn't level out during the turn. This indicated a troubling possibility. The hydraulic systems that control the aircraft's movements had lost pressure. The flight engineer watched in horror as all the hydraulic systems drained completely. Within seconds, the flight controls became completely ineffective. The captain turned to the flight engineer and asked if the hydraulic pressure had indeed dropped to zero. Unfortunately, their worst fears were confirmed as all indications showed no pressure in the hydraulic systems. The loss of all hydraulic power was a severe problem. The pilot's control over the plane became useless, and they couldn't make it climb, descend, or turn. To make matters worse, the rotor on the tail fin had been completely detached. The controller offered radar guidance to help the crew navigate back to a safe landing.
China 124, fly heading 090, radar vector to Oshima. Control, Roger, understood.
The plane entered a frightening cycle, repeatedly pitching up and climbing before losing speed and descending. Then, it would gain speed and pitch up again. This pattern continued, causing significant altitude changes with each repetition. Passengers were filled with fear as they faced this horrifying situation. Some began writing goodbye messages to their loved ones, while flight attendants hurriedly provided instructions on using the oxygen masks and used spare masks for themselves from the overhead compartments. A passenger on board captured this photo, showing the chaotic atmosphere in the cabin. It captures a flight attendant using one of the spare oxygen masks. Surprisingly, the pilots in the cockpit had not yet put on their own oxygen masks. They were fully focused on regaining control of the plane, overlooking this essential step. However, the lack of oxygen at their altitude of 24,000 feet was starting to affect them. At that height, there is only about 1/3 of the oxygen available compared to ground level. The pilot's concentration was narrowing, and their ability to think clearly was being impaired. Over the next few minutes, the crew members spoke less and less to each other. Tokyo Air Traffic Control tried to contact the flight, but the pilots were overwhelmed by the emergency and hypoxia, making them unable to respond to the controller's calls. Meanwhile, other airplanes in the area carried on as usual, following instructions from air traffic control to climb, descend, and change directions. In the Japanese skies, the pilots of Flight 123 and over 500 passengers were left to fend for themselves. The pilots still had control over one important part of the plane, the engines. They could try to minimize the plane's up and down motion by adjusting the engine power at specific times in the cycle. By reducing power during descent and increasing it during the subsequent climb, they hoped to stabilize the aircraft. However, due to hypoxia, the pilots faced the task of controlling the damaged plane using only the engines. Their training on the 747 and years of flying experience would be put to the test in this unprecedented situation. As the pilots adapted to their unique way of controlling the plane, Tokyo Air Traffic Control offered guidance and options.
Alright, your position 72 miles to Nagoya. Yeah, can you run to Nagoya?
The captain chose to return to Haneda instead of going to Nagoya, as Haneda had better emergency services and a larger runway. With 509 passengers on board, he needed all the help he could get. To lighten his workload, the controller informed him that he could now speak in Japanese. The flight engineers talked to the flight attendants through the interphone, trying to understand what had happened. The pilots were still unaware of the aircraft's damage. The flight attendant reported that the back of the plane and the baggage compartment had been damaged. The flight engineer informed the pilots and mentioned that the passengers were wearing oxygen masks. However, the pilots didn't respond. They were hypoxic and overwhelmed by their attempts to control the plane, unable to process the information. The flight engineer continued to urge the captain to initiate an emergency descent. The pilots quickly put on their oxygen masks and began descending. They adjusted the engine power to reduce the intense pitching of the plane. Although it still had some up and down movement, it was less severe now. This gave the crew hope. They realized they could control the plane's altitude to some extent by manipulating the engines. Let's take a short break. We've put a lot of effort into this video, and if you find it useful and informative, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching. However, they knew they had more challenges ahead if they wanted to safely reach an airport. Japan Airlines contacted the pilots to inquire about their current location and situation.
Nippon 36 to give control, roger.
But at that moment, the plane wasn't descending in an emergency. In fact, it hadn't descended at all. It was going up and down between 20,000 and 25,000 feet. To return to the airport, the crew needed to descend. The co-pilot pushed the control column forward with all their strength, but it didn't work. The pilots couldn't get the plane to descend, no matter how hard they tried. Then the flight engineer had an idea. They suggested lowering the landing gear to slow down the plane and help it descend. It was an unusual suggestion, just like everything else on this flight. The captain didn't believe they could lower the landing gear without hydraulic power. If the crew could only think of it, there was a way for them to lower the gear. On the 747 and most other aircraft, it is possible to lower the gear without hydraulic power by letting it drop under its own weight. The flight engineer suggested this method to the captain. The captain hesitated to lower the gear at that moment. They had been working hard to stabilize the plane's flight path and had made some progress. Lowering the gear could undo their efforts. However, the captain knew they had no choice but to do it eventually. They tried an alternate method to extend the gear. Slowly but surely, the massive landing gear of the 747 began to drop into place. A few moments later, they were fully down and locked. Aerodynamically, the results were inconsistent. No matter what the pilots tried, they could only stabilize either the vertical or the horizontal axis at a time, but not both simultaneously. It seemed like their situation was becoming hopeless. However, they didn't give up and continued to fight. Now, they decided to steer the plane back to Tokyo using the engines. The first officer increased power on the left engines while keeping the right engines at lower power. The plane swayed from side to side, but gradually it swayed back towards the right, heading towards the city. Tokyo Control tried to communicate, but the captain told the crew to focus on flying the plane and ignore the controller. With lower engine power and the gear fully extended, the plane began to descend. It went below 20,000 feet for the first time since leaving Tokyo. The pilots were exhausted both physically and mentally. In their tired state, they forgot to switch the thrust levers to correct the turn towards Tokyo. Instead, they reduced thrust on all engines, causing the plane to continue in a full circle instead of heading back to Tokyo. Inside the cabin, the passengers were running out of oxygen. If the pilots couldn't descend the plane to 10,000 feet soon, they would also suffer from oxygen deprivation. On the ground, astonished onlookers observed a 747 flying through the sky above them. Some individuals managed to take photos of the aircraft. Despite the low quality of these images, the absence of the tail was clearly visible. It was evident to everyone on the ground that the aircraft was in extreme distress. As the plane descended, the oxygen levels improved, allowing the pilots to think clearly again. They could now consciously assess their situation instead of just reacting. In the passenger cabin, a flight attendant announced that the passengers could soon remove their oxygen masks. As the plane descended, a new danger emerged, a towering mountain range directly ahead. The pilots understood that they needed to try something different to save the jet and its 521 passengers and crew. The first officer suggested lowering the flaps to reduce speed and prevent stalling. Despite the lack of hydraulic power, they activated the backup electrical system to lower the flaps. Surprisingly, it worked. By carefully adjusting the thrust levers, they stabilized the plane's flight path. Finally, after the turbulent emergency, the plane was flying level once again. This was their opportunity. They had to return to the airport immediately. The pilots reached out to Tokyo approach control, but due to the intense turbulence, they had become disoriented and had completely lost their sense of location. The flight engineer inquired of the controller. They were only 55 miles northwest of Haneda, which wasn't a considerable distance for a 747. If they could turn the plane around and head towards Tokyo, there was a possibility that they could safely return to the airport. The flaps, initially helping to stabilize the plane, began to extend uncontrollably. The left wing's flaps extended more than the right wing's, creating an imbalance. This imbalance caused the plane to gradually turn right as controls slipped away from the pilots. Despite the first officer's attempt to adjust the thrust levers, they unknowingly applied higher power to the left engines, exacerbating the situation. The plane started tipping over due to these factors. The plane found itself in a sideways position, rapidly descending towards the mountains below. It was diving at an astonishing rate of over 18,000 feet per minute, which was 10 times faster than normal. The pilots reacted instinctively, pulling back on the controls with all their strength. Unfortunately, their efforts were in vain as it became clear that it was too late to prevent the impending disaster. The plane's right wing and outer engine struck a mountain ridge, ripping them off. The aircraft flipped upside down and crashed into the mountainside at a high speed, creating a huge fireball. Air traffic controllers watched in despair as the plane disappeared from their radar screens. Their attempts to contact the pilots went unanswered. Within a minute, a Japanese military aircraft reported seeing a massive burst of flames, confirming the devastating outcome. The U.S. Air Force offered to help search for survivors, but Japanese authorities decided to send their own rescue forces instead. However, it took them 12 hours to reach the crash site. By the time they arrived, doctors noted that some passengers who could have been saved had already passed away due to their injuries. Out of the 524 passengers and crew on board, only 4 individuals managed to survive the tragic accident. Remarkably, all 4 survivors were seated in the rear section of the aircraft. Among them were Hiroki Yashizaki and Mikiko Yashizaki, a mother and daughter. Additionally, Yumi Okiai, an off-duty flight attendant, and Keiko Kawakami, a 12-year-old girl, were also fortunate enough to survive. Keiko was found trapped between tree branches, but sadly her mother and younger sister did not survive. Eventually, Keiko became the last survivor to be discharged from the hospital. As a result of the crash, Japan Airlines implemented stricter supervision and more comprehensive inspections for important repair work and regular maintenance procedures. Flight 123 still holds the unfortunate record of being the worst single aircraft crash in history. In memory of the 159 people who lost their lives in the South African Airlines Flight 295 tragedy.